Last talk got a tiny bit over time, so I just want to make sure I finish in time for the next one. So to make up for the lack of details in the previous presentation, I'm quickly going to go over the history of how Nintendo consoles implemented protection against piracy and other things. Mostly because I find it interesting history to see how all these things evolved. So this story, also you can find the slides again at this link. The story actually begins with Atari, not Nintendo, because Atari at the end of the 70s and the beginnings of the 80s had a massive success with their console, the VCS, later renamed to the 2600. But after a while, they were, for this console, many kind of shitty games were made that had bad advertising. Like the E.T. game is an infamous example of this. This actually got so bad that it led to what's called the video crash of 1983, which sounds kind of dramatic when you look back to it, because if you look at the newspapers at the time, they were saying like, yeah, look, it's just a bubble. Video games are not going to be a thing after this. They were kind of wrong, but oh well. But interestingly, what you can also find in the newspapers is, it's probably too small to read, but it's the boss of Nintendo saying that with the NES to not have another video game crash, they are going to impose strict quality control checks on the games that would be released for their new console, the NES. So that's how the NES came to be. And the security system for this is what the CIC, or the CIC, I'm not sure how it should be pronounced. It's a small chip that just sits next to the console, because the console was already being designed when the video game crash only started happening. So it's also not a surprise that it was just added onto the console at the end. But what it does is that you have one chip in the cartridge and one in the console, and they both generate a pseudo-random bit string. And whenever these two don't match, the one in the console will just shut down or hold reset, which means you just shut down the console. Now, as someone who would have such a console and want to make a game that doesn't have this CIC chip, you can just cut this pin on the motherboard and it will not shut down the console anymore. That's really simple to defeat, but sorry?
A random sequence of bits.
Yeah.
That's clocked by the main clock then, or?
Probably. I don't know about the details. I do know that this chip is a really weird 4-bit architecture that doesn't use an addition in the program counter, but an LSFR.
LSFR, yeah.
Yeah, but that's no. Also for the program counter, not for the output sequence.
Oh.
Yeah, it's really weird, but that's all I know about it. Sorry. So this is easy to defeat if you're just a customer, but if you are a game company who wants to sell games, then you also have to tell all your customers to screw open your console, cut this thingy here. They are not going to do that. So that's why it was good enough to enforce quality control, so that you could actually get such a chip from Nintendo and then distribute that with your game. This was pretty good because for the first ever Game Boy, Nintendo also used such an approach, but not with a technical approach, because this is it's portable. It has to be use less power. It has to be cheaper. So including such a chip in a game cartridge was not a good idea. So instead, they had whenever this console boots up, they have a small program that shows the Nintendo logo, makes the padding sound, but you probably have heard this story, that the boot up program also checks whether this logo is present at the start of the cartridge that you, here they go in at the top, that you have to put in your console. And because this is Nintendo, it's protected by trademarks, so whenever you include that in a video game cartridge, which is just a generic memory chip, you would actually violate the trademark, and then Nintendo can sue you, unless you pass their quality controls and that sort of stuff. And this system was really, it had the desired effect, because all the successors, the SNES, the N64, the Game Boy Color, and the Game Boy Advance used basically the same thing. like maybe the pseudo-random sequence was a bit different, the logo was, the actual bytes were a bit different, but no, it's 95% the same. But the problem is, these things are designed in the 80s and the 90s. These two were released after the turn of the century, which means that, in the 80s to, make your own cartridge, that's, you'd have to spend quite a bit of effort to, make the PCB, make the chips and that sort of stuff, and also to read it out for piracy. But at the turn of the century, these things were already existing, which is, the basic stamp and the PICAXE. These are kind of like an Arduino, but it's from the 90s, so they run BASIC instead of Arduino, but otherwise it's the same, and you can just use it to read out a cartridge and then reflash another memory and that sort of thing. So with these things, you could easily do piracy. So this started to be a really big problem for Nintendo because, for these consoles, it wasn't cheap enough to do, but here it definitely was. So what they did, at least for the GameCube, they had a special thing on their disk with a specific pattern that the disk drive in the console would look for, and if it's not there, like if you try to just burn a game on a regular CD or DVD, then it would just reject the disk and not play it. So to counter that, you have like these kinds of weird looking mod chips where you have to like first screw open your console, then solder it, and that sort of stuff. It's more annoying than just cutting a pin on the kick, but yeah, it's still works because, for the rest here, it's easier because it's just reading and burning a CD or DVD. So to make that a bit better, Nintendo finally discovered cryptography. And not just any cryptography, they discovered the Blowfish cipher because, this console, they probably started working on this in 2002 or 2003, which was just after the standardization of AES, which you would expect to see, so it's probably just too new, so they took something from the 90s. But the biggest problem here is that Blowfish, just like AES, is a symmetric cipher, so the key that's used to encrypt this is also the same key that you use to decrypt, and this key has to be in your console. So yeah, you really don't want this key to leak. But first they didn't do this thing. They actually were a bit smarter, and they had some kind of MITM thing here, which in the cartridge header, it says, yes, load this block of code to this area in RAM. But the boot ROM in this console has a time of check versus time of use for the destination address. So it will just say, yes, start running from the Game Boy cartridge the second time it's read, but not the first time. And that's how you just get regular code execution on this console. And then eventually someone figured out how to read the protected memory which contains the key. And that's really bad because now you have this. Yes, that's the R4 card, which you just have a micro SD, put it in your console and it runs whatever's on the micro SD. You've probably heard of this one. And for Nintendo, that's really bad because now it's super easy to pirate games. Compared to this thing, this is a lot of effort. And the problem is they really tried to use cryptography, but they didn't use it correctly, so that's a lot of effort completely wasted. So they tried to do better and finally discovered public key cryptography instead of symmetric key. So in these two consoles, all the games are verified with a public key instead of a private key, so if you just read it out, that's not going to do much. And also, because you now also could download games and put them on the system memory, also that is checked and verified using public key cryptography. Because also, this console, had like a small menu that could do a few things that was actually also not cryptographically verified, which is also not a good idea. But the Wii, the first hack that was discovered for the Wii was, first they could do this thing again with a disk drive to just boot older GameCube games in backwards compatibility mode. So they couldn't, they could run code, but it couldn't use any of the new features from the Wii. So what they did is they bridged the hackers bridged a few lines on the PCB using a pair of tweezers, which was used to actually forcibly change the RAM address from which the CPU was reading. And that way, they just discovered some cryptographic keys they weren't supposed to see, and then they also could just decrypt the entire system, the non-volatile memory of the system. And then analyzing that code, they also found another fizz that, in the signature verification, Nintendo was using string compare, which stops at the first null byte. So you can just, brute force a hash, and then hopefully the, first 4 or 5 or maybe 1 or 0 bytes will match, and then the other half will just be ignored. And that's pretty easy to do, and that's how you do signature forgery. So that's pretty bad. Interestingly, the DSI initially was very hard to hack because, someone made this setup, which was basically doing an MITM attack between the CPU and the DRAM, which is pretty impressive because that's a very fast connection.
64 bits or something? What's the bit?
It's 16-bit.
16, oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, they were using like a Spartan 3, I think. So it was still doable, but it's a really ugly mess of wires, so yeah. So with that, they were able to inspect code of games, like this is a game cartridge, and this contains the game code itself. This is where normally a SPI flash is, which contains the save game data. And they got the game code itself because that's stored in DRAM, but not the actual boot code because that's never touches DRAM. So they could find, oh wait, there's a vulnerability in this game. So if you in the parser that parses the save data, so if you just put a different thing there, you can take over the game. But that doesn't really give you access to the rest of the system, annoyingly. So Nintendo thought, yes, that's a good thing. We finally managed to do something. So let's build upon this idea, but make it a bit better. So to stop game exploits from being an easy thing to do, they actually took the hardware, made it stronger, and added more to the security system by, for example, introducing an operating system. And it's actually a microkernel operating system, so you cannot just go from user mode to kernel mode. You first have to go through a few services, and then there's also like a separate cryptography and other security stuff core next to the main cores. You have to go through all these layers to attack the system. This was still eventually possible, like many people did this in many different ways. But also, we're now in 2010 or 2015, and fault injection attacks and other physical attacks became possible because someone made this thing, which is just a thing you can buy for $300, or people can make their own, or you have things like this, and that was used. This is already a spoiler, but this. So that way you can inject physical faults like voltage glitching to also attack consoles instead of only using software attacks. And that way, you can, the boot ROM of the 3DS was dumped, and then the source code was analyzed. It was discovered that the RSA verification in the 3DS contains a buffer overflow, which is like the one place you really, really don't want to have a buffer overflow. But yeah, and that way you can just take over the console. And interestingly, the 3DS also has DSi backwards compatibility mode, which also has to implement the DSi boot ROM stuff, but they implemented it in regular firmware. So now they could just inspect that firmware and know how to decrypt the firmware of the DSi, which is like the second boot station eMMC I talked about earlier. That's that one. So they could find a vulnerability in that and exploit it. And now you also have an almost full jailbreak of the DSi because the 3DS was hacked, which is great. Like, it's great to have secrets hidden in hardware, like the RSA key for the DSi, but don't leak them. So finally, there's the Switch. I know there's the Wii U in there, but it's mostly the same thing as the Wii, but only the bits I didn't talk about. And it also looks a bit like attacking the 3DS. Like, first you have to attack the operating system, and then you have to attack the iOS U. So it's kind of more of the same. So that's why I'm skipping the Wii U. Sorry. So we finally arrive at the Nintendo Switch, which is also based on, at least the operating system is based on the same concept as a 3DS. It's like also microkernel architecture, but the names are different. It now has ASLR, so you again find lots of exploit that first exploit the game, then exploit the service, then eventually exploit the kernel, that kind of thing. And it also has a secure boot chain, but these things happened, and they were subsequently patched because unlike all the previous other consoles, Nintendo is really aggressively patching security vulnerabilities in the Switch. But again, because this happened, someone eventually figured out that the boot ROM of the Switch has a USB stack to do USB things, and it contains a use after free, which allows you to also just take over the boot ROM, and that way also dump all the keys. Now, interestingly, for the Switch, that's not where the story ends, because Nintendo not only released a new hardware revision of the Switch that fixes this bug, they also changed where the keys are stored, and normally that's somewhere near the CPU, but they moved it to the GPU, which also contains cryptography things, because video DRM is a thing, sadly. So now the entire GPU had to be reverse engineered, which you can read about in this article. It also contains, information about how to extract the keys. It's way too long to talk about here, so I'm sorry, you'll have to follow this link. And also, someone used Foldatex again to also extract the keys. But yeah, in the end, it's kind of really interesting to see how Nintendo, normally when you have a boot ROM vulnerability, that's end of the story. The console is completely broken. Not here. That's really fascinating to see that they actually managed to do this. So that's about it. You can see how, between all these consoles, who you consider as your attacker really shapes how the countermeasures were implemented. And this simply because of how history progresses and how technology improves, that also changes. And finally, you might have a good design for your security system. That doesn't mean it's implemented correctly. That's it. Are there any questions? All right.